the Silverado Springs Memory Care Posse. There was a sign on Smiler's door that read, "No entry, Wildcat loose." It was written with a bright red Sharpie in what was unmistakably Juanita's childish scrawl. As nice a care assistant as that girl was, she really wasn't the brightest button on any shirt. And spelling certainly wasn't her strong point. There was no wildcat in the room, of course. But everyone at the home was afraid of wildcats, so it gave them the privacy they needed to clean up the mess. Besides which, had they written murderous slimy monster at large, it was likely no one would have believed it, or the residents would have been tempted to poke their noses in for a look-see. As Louis Jones ambled by Smiler's room on his way down to the breakfast room, he snuck a peek in through the gap afforded by the slightly ajar door, and saw Juanita and her supervisor, Carl, cleaning up Smiler's room. Mopping, scrubbing, tidying, they buzzed around in there like white-clad industrious insects, seemingly oblivious to the fact that Smiler's body was still in his bed. It was early yet, far too early for the good folks of Carpenter's funeral services to come collect Smiler. Silverado Springs Memory Care was their farthest point of call, and they'd most likely be there around lunchtime. Still, there really was no rush. It wasn't as if poor old Smiler was going anywhere anytime soon, especially considering the state he was in. Ain't no wildcat did that to Smiler. Louie to his handful of closest friends, mumbled the Bones, the small care center dog that scampered around his feet as he walked by. They had a trio of small dogs around because it was supposed to cheer up the patients and keep them calm, but all the damn thing seems to do was crap everywhere and yip at nothing. Ignoring the dog, Louis allowed himself to be lured away from the gruesome scene in Smiler's room by the delectable smell of cooked bacon that wafted up from the kitchen. Or was it sausage? Damned if he could remember. And by the time Louis had reached the stairs, the memory of the horror he'd seen in the room had already faded to little more than fuzz. "Good morning," Louis greeted the two strangers, one of each sex, he noted, who sat at his table. Louis knew it was his table because there was a place setting with his name and the picture of the same face he had printed on his ID badge in his pocket. "Thank you, Stacy," Louis said to the morbidly overweight lady who helped him to his seat. Stacy was your salt-of-the-earth single mom type who more often than not worked double shift at the center just to make ends meet and pay the rental on her double-wide. She always had a broad smile on her face, as if she were playing a long and elaborate joke on everyone, and she always had a kind word for the residents. In the center of the breakfast table sat a small red vase of fake daisies that sported a thin veneer of old dust. Sticking up from the midst of the flowers was a tall wooden placeholder, at the top of which was glued a picture of a monarch butterfly on a milkweed flower, its gaudy wings spread as if it were about to take flight. Each one of the half-dozen or so tables in the room were similarly laid out, each with a different creature on its placeholder. This was so that the elderly residents could better remember their designated seat should they forget that their ID was in their pocket. Colorful animals are apparently easier for dementia sufferers to recall than numbers or letters, and although Louis had nothing against the monarch as such, he would have preferred to have been seated at the baboon table. The strategy did work. Somewhere in the hazy recesses of Louis's Alzheimer's brain, he did remember the butterfly, and could actually relate it to where he was supposed to be. Yet, had it not been for the fat woman's large-lettered name badge, he'd have been lost as to her damn name. Louis sat down and scrutinized the two people with whom he was to eat breakfast, and he had a feeling in the back of his foggy mind that he was supposed to know who they were. Likewise, the light gray notebook that lay adjacent to the white plastic cutlery in front of him. "Say, where did your friend go?" Stacy asked with that broad smile of hers. The woman at Louis's table stared blankly up at the big woman. "Guy with the hat? He was here a minute ago." Stacy continued, but was met with nothing more than puzzled looks from all three patients at the table. "I'll go get your breakfast," she said to Louis with an exasperated snort, and waddled off towards the kitchen. "I do remember a man," the woman said quietly. "Do you?" Louis shook his head, as did his other breakfast companion. "He was tall," the woman carried on, as if trying to convince herself. "Or was he short?
Definitely one of the two, she said with conviction. Well, you look at me. I spend all day around you dementia patients, and my memory starts to go. Are you sure it's not contagious? Enjoy your bacon, Louis. Stacy reappeared, and with a smile she plonked a white plastic plate in front of him. Bacon? Louis said as he examined the plate's greasy passengers. That's sausage. No, it's definitely bacon, 3 strips to go with your egg and hash brown. What is? Louis asked. Stacy chuckled and gave Louis a pat on the shoulder as if the exchange were nothing more than a private joke between them. She then waddled off in the direction of a sad-faced old lady who had barely a handful of white wisps of cotton candy hair clinging to her head. The old lady shuffled into the breakfast room behind her aluminum walker. It was one of those with the slit-open tennis balls on the front legs to save the thing from scraping the laminate floors. Good morning, Louis, the woman at Louis's table said. I trust that you slept well? I did, thank you. Louis forced a smile and reached deep into the back of his mind to try to recall the woman with the jet-black hair. Died? Wig? He figured it best not to ask. And whose fashion sense appeared to have stalled the year Buddy Holly died. It's Constance. The woman's voice was patient, this being a ritual they had performed every morning for the past 3 years. Ah, yes, Constance. At the sound of the name, something vague formed on the edges of Louis's crumbling brain. It felt like a long-lost lover walking towards him, arms spread wide through a thick, swirling mist. Connie, Louis said with a triumphant smile. Constance hated having her name abbreviated so. In her book, it was a surefire sign of laziness. Still, she was prepared to set that minor irritation aside for the time being, at least until poor old Louis regained his bearings, a task that seemed to take a little longer each morning. At just 67, Constance was very much the baby of their rapidly dwindling group. And since that Jenny What's-Her-Face had passed not all that long ago, she was also the only female. Constance was, always had been, a proud, vain lady. She kept her petite figure trim with a diet as good as she could get at the memory care center, daily exercise, and formidable undergarments that supported her not inconsiderable breasts. She awoke at 5:30 sharp each morning to apply her makeup. The memory of how was thankfully stored in her long-term vaults and thus far remained untouched by the ravages of the disease she still tried to deny, so as to face each and every day looking her absolute best. Dementia had crept up on Constance in the last year of her 50s, shortly after her husband's accident. Some had speculated at the time that it had been God's retribution since the justice system had failed, and had begun to eat away at her brain like some ravenous, malevolent parasite. She had been dumped at Silverado Springs by her daughter, who Constance maintained simply did not want to have to deal with the inconvenience of an ailing mother. Although the incident in which Constance had popped her daughter's family's dog into the oven for a few minutes to dry off after its walk one rainy day may have had more to do with Janice's decision than pure selfishness. The kids, Constance's trio of adorable grandchildren, had been there to witness the full horror as their beloved Yorkshire Terrier screamed like a banshee as it spun around in slow, torturous circles. The dog had still been squealing when the microwave had finally pinged, and Constance's grandchildren had shortly thereafter embarked upon an expensive round of intensive therapy. They visited from time to time, but Constance would see the look of fear in the children's eyes and sense the trepidation in Janice and her husband. And she knew in her heart that things would never be the same again. Welcome back, Louis. Constance reached for Louis's hand and gave it a fond squeeze. Yeah, welcome back, buddy. Louis's other dining companion, a tall, lanky black guy, said through a mouthful of bacon, How you doing? Louis wasn't sure exactly how he should answer the man's question, nor did he feel that he was back from anything, although he did find that dim thoughts swirled into his comprehension, such as his memory of Connie, and if he grasped them before they floated away back into the fog, he could actually retain snippets of the memories they represented. It was a slow and frustrating process, but it was pretty much all Louis had. There were fat, gaping holes in Louis's memory, which he imagined mirrored the fat, gaping holes in his inexorably deteriorating brain. And those holes just kept on expanding.
like the sinkholes that open up beneath small mining towns, growing ever larger to swallow chunks of Lewis's mind and leave fewer and fewer places for new memories to stick. In some ways, Lewis considered himself lucky in so much he still enjoyed more loosened moments than most, even if they did require a kickstart to get them moving every morning. Lewis's short-term memory, once he brushed off that morning daze, actually retained a great deal. Sadly, though, because of the Alzheimer's that had been systematically destroying his gray matter for the latter 12 years of his 79, that ephemeral part of his mind was wiped clean every night as he slept, much as a teacher wipes the class whiteboard at the end of each school day. The brain function responsible for shunting information to the vaults of his more secure long-term memory had almost completely disintegrated. On some days, if he concentrated really hard, Lewis imagined he could feel the break in the virtual cable. Ask Lewis Jones what he had for dinner the previous day, he'd be clueless, but he could tell you what color pants he was wearing the day after Reagan was shot. "I'm doing okay. Maroon, isn't it?" Lewis replied to the black man after some pondering. "Muldoon," the black guy corrected with a fond smile. "Still, that's closer than you got yesterday, my old friend." He shoveled a gelatinous glob of scrambled eggs into his mouth, choosing to ignore the bits that fell from his spoon and became entangled in the straggled gray hairs of his sparse beard. "Of course," Lewis smiled back as clumsy memories of the guy swam into view like the fake ghosts at a carnival horror house. "How the devil are you, Whitey?" Lewis's grin was a broad one. He was delighted with the flash of clarity his friend's prompt had afforded. Whitey Muldoon was a musician, played jazz in the Big Easy under the moniker Sticky Fingers Muldoon back in the day. He even had a record deal with someone who claimed to have worked with Bunny Berrigan sometime before the trumpet player had gone the way of most jazz musicians in the early part of the century and drank himself to death. Muldoon had thin, gaunt features that sat uneasy with his lanky 6'2" frame, and he had huge, skinny hands with impossibly long fingers. And in those rare moments of lucidity his own advanced dementia afforded, and in which Muldoon's rotting mind remembered the notes, those fingers could pick out a tune on the rec room piano that would bring the residents to tears. Lewis had first met Muldoon at his wife's funeral. Muldoon was there because he had been Bethany Jones's lover for the better part of 20 years. I don't want to appear rude on such an occasion, Lewis had approached the tall, shiny-faced guy who was skulking at the rear of the church before the service. But just who the fuck are you? He'd long suspected Beth of being less than entirely faithful throughout their 45 years together, and had been guilty of the odd dalliance himself whilst away on the many business trips and sales conferences his job had demanded. So, as the man said, glass houses, stones and all that. And of all the things Lewis Jones considered himself to be, a hypocrite wasn't one of them. "I knew Bethany." Muldoon had at first been coy, embarrassed even. "She was a remarkable woman." What else could Lewis do but agree? He invited Muldoon down to the front line of pews for the service and afterwards to his home. That night, long after they lowered the woman they both loved into the cold, hard ground, they'd spent the night on Lewis's porch cracking cold ones and reminiscing about just how remarkable a woman Bethany had been and some of the weird shit she liked to get up to in the sack. The two had thus become firm friends, and the universe had once more woven its perverse magic when they had both been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's within the same month and drafted into Silverado Springs together. "You hear what happened to Smiler?" Muldoon broke Lewis's splintered reverie. "No," Lewis replied. "I'm guessing he passed on?" Death was a regular visitor to the Silverado Springs memory care, more so than the relatives of the majority of the residents. It was a safe guess.
"I heard he was murdered,"
Constance chipped in, a glint in her eye at the thought.
"We should ask Carl."
"Ask me what?" Carl's ears pricked up at the mention of his name. He was making his way through the breakfast area to change since he had gotten a smudge or two of blood on his scrubs whilst cleaning out the old man's room, and he wanted it off him toot sweet.
"Is it true they killed Smiler?"
Constance was as direct as ever. No point beating around the bush when there's a good chance she'd forget the question before it was answered. "Nobody killed anybody, Connie," Carl patronized her. Mr. Deakins passed over peacefully in his sleep. A strange smile. You know he'd been sick for quite some time. He was 85, you know. If there's someone running around killing the inmates, you would tell us, wouldn't you, Carl? Muldoon asked. You'd be the first to know, Mr. Muldoon. And your guests here, not inmates, Carl deflected. So we are able to leave the facility whenever we like. Muldoon's voice was his typical deadpan. Not on your own, and not until activity day, Carl told him. You know full well, Mr. Muldoon, and it's not a facility, it's... Case rested. Muldoon cracked a grin and spread his arms wide in a, well, there you are then, gesture. He plucked a cold, stiff strip of bacon from his plate and crunched on it loudly as if that further underlined his point. Leave the poor man alone, Lewis admonished his friend. There was something in a dingy corner of his mind that advised him that perhaps Carl was not in the mood for banter this morning. He also eyed the 3 empty chairs at the Monarch table and wondered if there perhaps was something in Muldoon's suggestion of someone other than death bumping their fellow inmates off, after all. Carl sped off towards the kitchen and disappeared behind the door with the brass staff-only plaque screwed to it, leaving Lewis, Muldoon, and Constance alone with their cold breakfast and stilted conversation that sounded as if the 3 were meeting for the very first time. Lewis chewed on the last of his bacon. It was satisfying enough, although it felt rough and salty in his mouth and split into slivers like shards of rubbery glass. As he munched, he contemplated the notebook that sat by his left hand. It was a pleasant, light gray moleskin, half letter-sized and with a broad strip of black elastic to hold it shut. The elastic reminded him of the suspenders his grandfather used to wear to keep his pants up.
I think it's yours,
Constance told him. Why's that? Lewis asked.
Because it's by your place at the table,
Constance replied before cottoning on to Lewis's joke. You got you good there, Connie, old girl. Muldoon guffawed and almost choked on his slurp of tea. Lewis winked at Constance as she pursed her lips at him to pretend that she was disgruntled. He picked up the notebook and was surprised that its covers felt very velvety beneath his fingers, much as he would have imagined an actual mole's would feel. Perhaps, he couldn't help but wonder, they actually made the things from real moles. Upon opening the book, Lewis discovered that there was a name written in neat black ink on the inside cover. The handwriting and the name looked surprisingly familiar, but it took a minute or two for it to filter through his muttered brain cells that both belonged to him. It is mine, Lewis informed his breakfast companions with a grin. Look, it says Lewis Jones right here. He lifted the book up and turned it around to show them his name and the writing below it that was in an altogether different hand. Happy birthday, Grandpa. A tear formed in Lewis's eye and a sick lump rose up in the back of his throat. He was a grandfather, and therefore, by default, a father too. He had family out there in the world, and he couldn't remember a damned thing, and at that particular moment, Lewis would have given anything to have had even the faintest glimmer of a memory of them. Constance reached for Lewis's hand and held it whilst he struggled with his emotions. It had been this same way every morning for as long as she could recall, Lewis discovering as if for the first time that he had a family. For Constance, the saddest thing of all, other than watch the man she cared for deeply facing the same pain anew every single day, was that Lewis's loving son, daughter-in-law, and 3 beautiful granddaughters visited him every week, and he was always so incredibly happy in their company. And Lewis's cruel brain, in common with hers and Muldoon's deteriorating gray matter, would misplace those precious memories overnight whilst he slept. Which is why things were written down in that book, otherwise everything would have been forgotten. Lewis flicked through the notebook, his eyes darting to and fro across the tightly written handwriting that filled almost 2/3 of the silken pages. His brow would furrow in a quizzical expression when he happened upon places where the occasional page or two had been torn out. Muldoon peered across the breakfast table, slurping on his cold tea with all the finesse of a buffalo at the watering hole. So? He inquired. What's in the book, Lewis? He strained his eyes to try reading the neatly printed words upside down. And what's that supposed to mean?
He jabbed a long, bony finger towards the book, to what he guessed was the title written in block capital letters at the top of each and every page. The Silverado Springs Memory Care Posse. Lewis read out loud the neatly printed words.
What the hell is that supposed to mean?
Muldoon wrinkled up his nose as if he'd caught a whiff of something particularly disgusting.
I think it's us.
Lewis looked his old friend straight in the eye. Yeah, it's us, all right. Look. He spun the book around on the stained cotton tablecloth and pointed at one of its pages. Muldoon and Constance leaned in to catch a better look. Constance had to lift up her chin to see through the bottom part of her narrow spectacles.
Chuck Rifkin?
Muldoon looked perplexed.
Who the heck is Chuck Rifkin?
He nodded at a list of names in the center of the right-hand page.
Janie Martinez. Now that does ring a vague bell.
Constance mused and closed her eyes in order to search for the memory that she simply knew was skulking in some far corner of her head somewhere. Smiler's name is on the list too. Lewis ran his finger down the half-dozen names that were all written in meticulous cursive. Whitey Muldoon, that's you, I guess? He said to Muldoon, and this one is me. Lewis appeared pleased to have recognized his own name for the first time, although he'd only seen it a minute or so ago at the front of the book.
And that one is me.
Constance was back with them, the fuzzy image of her erstwhile friend Janie Martinez still loitering on the periphery of her mind. Pretty much all she could recall was that Janie had died, although that could have been years ago. Or yesterday.
So why are those ones crossed out?
Muldoon reached over the table and poked a finger at the first three names on the list. There were thin, straight pencil lines through the names Chuck, Janie, and Smiler, which looked as if they had been drawn with the aid of a ruler. Lewis flicked through the notebook, the pages rustling softly as he turned them, as if they were whispering their secrets to him with quiet, impatient voices. This has happened before, he announced, and the suddenness of his voice startled the others. Muldoon almost dropped his tea, his fourth of the morning, and Constance jumped from the muddle of her thoughts, which were almost instantly forgotten. Muldoon grunted. Smiler, Lewis said. What happened to Smiler has happened before, I think to each of these people. He flicked back to the list of crossed-out names for emphasis.
What happened?
Lewis fought to recall what he'd seen earlier that morning, and something that Constance had asked the care assistant guy. But it was like peering through a thick black curtain into impenetrable darkness. I looked into Smiler's room, and there was... The word just refused to form. It felt to Lewis as if there was just a deep, dark hole in his brain where the word he wanted ought to be. That red stuff that comes out of you when you shave, he compensated.
Foam?
Muldoon was genuinely confused by this concept.
You have red shaving foam?
Constance asked him.
Who does?
Muldoon slurped at his cooling tea. Lewis joined in.
Carl did say that he passed.
Constance tried her best to be helpful, although she was having difficulty remembering exactly who the care assistant was. And according to this, so did Chuck and Janie. Lewis scanned the notebook, increasingly frustrated by the missing pages. Something niggled at the back of his mind that there must have been very important things written on them.
We're in an elderly care facility,
Muldoon added with a wry smile and a twinkle in his rheumy old eyes.
Of course the inmates die. It's what us old folk do best.
A smile. I think there's more to it than that. Lewis glanced up at his old friend, and I think that we were investigating it, quite possibly even trying to put a stop to it.
You talking about murder, Lewis?
There was a glint in Muldoon's eyes that Lewis didn't much care for.
Isn't that what the police are for?
He drew out the word as if he were relishing its caress upon his tongue. It came out as police. I don't know. Perhaps. Maybe? Lewis struggled. According to the notes he'd made in the notebook, whatever had happened to the owners of the three struck-out names had happened overnight, and whilst he, Constance, and Muldoon had quite clearly pooled their memories and theories to write down in the moleskin, the recollection had been nebulous to say the least.
Then it looks like I'm next. Muldoon pointed with a shaking finger at his name on the page. So, what are we going to do about that? Lewis turned over a page or two, more to be away from that ominous list of names. That did contain his own, remember. Then, in vague hope of finding an answer hidden amidst the disjointed prose, he was going to need more time to read and inwardly digest his forgotten writings before anything close to answers presented themselves. Suffice to say, though, the 3 on the list prior to Muldoon were deceased and crossed out, so perhaps it was safe for them to assume. Damn it! Lewis growled as once more his brain drew a complete blank and his thoughts tumbled into a bottomless black hole. Muldoon queried.
What if Lewis and I were to keep watch over you? Constance filled the silence.
All night?
Muldoon raised a skeptical eyebrow. Well, I don't seem to need all that much sleep these days. Constance smiled at the 2 men. And Lewis only forgets things when he sleeps, so I'd say it was doable.
Yeah, that's what I suggested here. Lewis drew a finger along several lines of his own writing. We sit with you from midnight till the sun comes up. That's it.
That's what?
Constance said. Muldoon grunted. It would help if we didn't all have memories like that blue fish in finding something, Lewis declared, his frustration bubbling to the fore. Wasn't it a redfish? Muldoon asked.
Finding red?
Constance threw in. No, that's not it. Lewis said as he racked his brain, the image of the fish tantalizingly out of reach in there. I think it was definitely blue.
What was blue?
Constance asked. Muldoon grunted and took a slurp at his tea. Lewis sighed a loud, rattling sigh. It really was going to be a long wait until midnight. It got dark early at Silverado Springs. Lewis figured that was because they closed the heavy blinds tight shut and moved the hands forward on the clocks to fool the inmates into retiring early. However, since he couldn't exactly remember what had occurred on the previous nights, he really couldn't say for sure. He'd spent much of the day reading through the Moleskin. He read and reread those parts of it that made little sense to him, yet made him think that they should. The majority of the notebook's contents seemed to be disjointed conjecture and odd ramblings about what they thought was happening to their fellow residents. There were even mentions of contributions from Janie and Smiler. Whatever was going on had started with Chuck, because there was not one word of his written down from the clandestine meetings that Lewis had obviously, so diligently, minuted. The popular conspiracy theory amongst the dwindling members of the Silverado Springs Memory Care Posse was that the facility was killing off the inmates and continuing to collect their residence fees. Poring through the notes, Lewis couldn't see how that theory got around the one simple fact of the deceased residents' families. Surely they'd notice their loved one's absence on visiting days.
Unless, of course, they only selected those whose families never visited. This upset Lewis, since he'd only just relearned, that he had a family, and now he had to deal with the fact that they never damn well visited him.
I'm not sure how a man's supposed to sleep with you sat there thinking all freaking night.
Muldoon moaned from his bed and then tossed around noisily to emphasize the point.
And that goddamn nightlight is killing me too. What am I, 5?
Lewis glanced at the small dim light that sat in his lap. The LED bulb in the thing emitted a faint bluish light that was barely adequate enough for him to read the notebook by, let alone disturb his complaining friend's sleep. Lewis was sitting mouse quiet inside the cramped closet in Muldoon's room, his back twinging and his dicky hip throbbing like a bastard. He peered out through the thin gap he'd left in the door at his friend, who was supposed to be fast asleep by now.
"You can't hear me thinking, you dumb old coot,"
he whispered loudly to Muldoon. "Go to sleep already."
I can't. It's kind of weird knowing that you're in there watching me sleep.
At the moment, all I'm doing is watching you fidget and complain, Muldoon, Lewis growled. You'll not be worth crap in the morning if you don't get your full 8 hours, you know that. He really couldn't believe the man. They'd shared the same woman for near on 2 decades, and here he was bleeding because Lewis was hiding in his closet.
Well, I just can't,
Muldoon grumbled and thrashed around some more beneath his crisp white sheets to further make his point. Lewis checked his watch and grunted. He'd been in Muldoon's closet for almost an hour now, upon relieving Constance of her watch at midnight. The old fart had managed to sleep like a baby when she'd been watching over him, although Lewis suspected that she'd not actually spent her watch in amongst Muldoon's clothes. There'd been a definite dent in the bed where a small feminine frame had laid, and Lewis was convinced that he had touched said dent when he arrived. It would still have been warm. Reading through the notebook, it stirred up a whole plethora of blurred memories in Lewis's deteriorating mind. Images of people he thought he should know, nebulous faces that swam tantalizingly out of reach. Conversations that he felt sure he'd be able to remember if only he could think deep enough. It felt as if by reading the notebook he was sifting through the collective mush of what remained of his and his fellow posse's neurons. Hey, didn't that used to be a rock group? Finally, Muldoon was asleep. At first, Lewis thought he was just pretending, but once the rhythmic buzzsaw of the man's resonant snoring split through the darkness, it became clear that he wasn't faking. Lewis smiled to himself at this. Bethany used to hate snoring, and she would actually banish him to the sofa whenever he had a cold, and with help from his blocked sinuses he would rattle the bedroom windows. And Lewis couldn't help but wonder if she did the same with Muldoon on the nights she'd spent in his bed. Lewis sat there in the dark and discomfort and listened as his friend snored. He stretched his legs out across the full length of the closet, just enough room, and absently stroked his fingertips over the notebook's soft cover. The book rested on Lewis's knees, along with a cheap Bic pen and Constance's thin pen-light torch. They had considered taking pictures, but since none of them had a camera or a cell phone with a camera, Silverado Springs policy, too many residents used smartphones to create homegrown pornography, which was also banned in all of its many and wondrous forms. It would have meant stealing one. Also, it was detailed in the notebook from a previous meeting that using a flash would be foolish as it would give the observer away. All he was there to do was to record what he saw in the notebook, in lieu of being able to remember, of course, and alert the staff should anything untoward happen. It didn't once occur to Lewis that if they followed this procedure with Janie and Smiler, then how come they had still wound up in the back of Carpenter's grubby old hearse? The door opened. At first, it was just a crack that let in a sliver of the subdued light from the hallway beyond. It seemed to Lewis's overactive imagination that someone was checking out Muldoon's room to make sure he was asleep. And perhaps to see if someone was hiding in the closet. Lewis held his breath, fearful that whoever it was at Muldoon's door would be able to hear him breathing. He squinted through the thin gap of the closet door, his heart pounding so hard that he feared that Muldoon's visitor would actually be able to hear that, if not his labored breath. Slowly, carefully, Muldoon's door eased open. If this had been a movie, Lewis thought, it would have creaked loudly on complaining hinges to the strains of tense violin music. This not being a movie, though, the door remained silent as it swung open. Then, the unmistakable shape of Carl's head appeared between the white lacquered door and its frame. Doesn't that guy ever sleep? Lewis thought to himself and let go of the stale breath in his lungs, relieved beyond belief to see Carl's familiar face. Even though, come the morning, he'd have to read the man's name badge to remember who the hell he was. Of course the staff checked in on the inmates. Between 12 and 3 in the morning was the most popular time for old folk to shuffle off their mortal coil, so it made perfect sense. Lewis watched as Carl's head retreated back into the hallway, no doubt satisfied that Muldoon's nasal reverberations were a sure sign that he hadn't passed on to the great beyond. The slit of light grew thinner, then thinner still, until Lewis heard the faint click of the latch as Muldoon's door closed, and all was dark once again. Before long, Lewis's eyes began to close. His eyelids felt almost preternaturally heavy, and Lewis began to regret not having brought along one of those energy drinks Constance had tried foisting upon them. One of those in a tiny bottle that promised 5 hours of uninterrupted energy and tasted like stale cat pee. And the more he fought it, the more sleep crept up on Lewis, overwhelming him like Dorothy's sea of poppies. And before he knew what was happening, Lewis Jones was sound asleep in his cramped boudoir. Beyond the closet door, the outlined shape of a man appeared from the shadows. Neither tall nor short, fat nor thin, the shape congealed within the ink black of the shadows to step out into Muldoon's room, its nebulous shape becoming ever more solid. The shadowy man wore a plain darkish gray suit, white shirt, black shoes. The only detail of note was that he wore a hat atop his neatly coiffed head. The hat itself was of an unremarkable style, gray and squat like those worn on 100,000 heads day in, day out. In fact, there was absolutely nothing remarkable about the man who strode with purpose towards where Whitey Muldoon slumbered peacefully. He was precisely the kind of guy who was instantly forgettable, even outside of an Alzheimer's care facility. Stick him in front of 100 people in broad daylight and you'd get 100 different descriptions, not one of them accurate. He was exactly the guy one could pass on the street a dozen times and not once registered that you'd crossed paths before. And if you looked away for a second or two, you'd look back at him as if for the very first time. Yet as ordinary as the man appeared, his purpose was most decidedly extraordinary. Lewis awoke as the dark of the man's shadow passed by the narrow chink in the closet door, for that fraction of a moment swallowing the view of Muldoon's sleeping form. Lewis grunted himself awake. Immediately he clamped a hand over his mouth as he peeped out and saw the stranger standing over his friend's bed. As the man contemplated the sleeping Muldoon, Lewis attempted to stand within the confines of the closet, only to find that his hip had locked up and he was unable to shift himself off of his bony ass. Panicking and decidedly frustrated with his own body's failings, Lewis gripped the notebook and pencil tight in his hand and eased his weight over to his other hip. There really was nothing else to do than wait for his errant joint to right itself. Squinting through the gap in the door and using the feeble sliver of light that oozed from his penlight, Lewis jotted down a note or two, although he found it difficult to find the words, any words, to describe the inordinately plain stranger in Muldoon's bedroom. The guy in the hat bent over Muldoon and appeared to whisper something into the sleeping man's ear. Lewis thought he saw the faintest glimmer of a smile on his friend's face, and more than anything he'd witnessed thus far, that smile chilled Lewis down to his aching old bones. Lewis rocked his butt side to side. Sometimes that would help his hip along some, whilst other times it only served to make the rusted old joint a whole hell of a lot worse. But he had to do something. Finally, and with a pop so loud Lewis was amazed it hadn't woken Muldoon, his hip ground back into place and Lewis found himself mobile once more. But by the time Lewis had struggled to his feet and had plucked up enough courage to leave the sanctuary of the closet, the strange, plain-looking man had his decidedly ordinary-looking hand rested gently on Whitey Muldoon's head. "What the hell are you doing?" Lewis burst through the closet door and hissed loudly at the stranger. He was keen to keep his voice low so as not to attract Carl's attention, but was unsure as to why. There was a peaceful serenity about the stranger, and a niggle at the back of his mind that prevented him from screaming the place down. The stranger was obviously doing something to Muldoon, as was evident by the sleeping man's low, breathy mumbling and the frantic darting of his eyes beneath their firmly closed lids. So why could he not bring himself to call out? Lewis pondered this dilemma as he crossed the short distance between the closet and the bed, all the while not daring to take his eyes off the man in the hat. The man looked up from his contemplation of Muldoon, all the while keeping his hand placed firmly on the man's head as if it were glued there. He gazed into Lewis's eyes with a blank, unemotional expression, as if waiting for him to say something. There was a spark of familiarity there, although Lewis would swear to his dying day that he had never met the man before in his life. "I'm going to call the orderly." Lewis broke the cloying silence between them. "You shouldn't be in here." There was something akin to the faintest of twinkles in the gray man's empty eyes as he brought up his free hand and pressed the index finger lightly to his own lips. "Don't do that, Lewis," Muldoon murmured, and his eyes flickered open. "Please." The sound of his friend's voice took Lewis aback, even more so the wide, vacant stare of Muldoon's deep brown eyes. The man looked for all the world as if he was viewing something quite mesmerizing. And although he had spoken his name, Lewis had the inescapable feeling that so far as Muldoon was concerned, he simply wasn't there. The stranger returned his gaze to Muldoon, as if not in the least bit concerned about Lewis's threat to cause a ruckus and bring Carl and the night shift compatriots running. "I can remember," Muldoon said, and his eyes fixed on Lewis's, and in them Lewis saw such wakefulness and such intense clarity that the breath caught in his throat. "What can you remember, old friend?" Lewis whispered as his knees brushed against the side of Muldoon's bed.
Everything.
Muldoon's lips trembled as he spoke.
I can remember everything.
A smile played across those lips, and for the first time in a great many years, Muldoon looked completely happy.
Come, sit with me,
Muldoon asked Lewis and patted the side of the bed. Unquestioning, Lewis lowered his complaining hip onto the edge of the doughy, welcoming bed, relieved to have taken his weight off of the aching joint, even though this whole situation had turned most decidedly odd.
They all came back.
Muldoon beamed up at Lewis, his eyes fixed firmly on his friend's, but still distant.
Who came back? Lewis asked. He tried his level best to ignore the strange man's hand that rested, not too hard, not too lightly, on Muldoon's sweat-slicked head.
They all did,
Muldoon told him, and Lewis wished the old fart would quit being so goddamn cryptic.
My daughter, my grandkids, the guys in the band.
You remember them? Lewis stared at his friend in disbelief. It had been more years than he cared to recall since Muldoon had shown even the smallest signs of remembering his family, let alone the boys in Sticky Fingers Muldoon's ragtime band. All had been lost to the ravages of the dementia that was slowly but surely consuming his brain.
Beth,
Muldoon whispered with a serene smile playing around his lips.
I remember Beth.
It was a shock for Lewis to hear his beloved wife's name again, especially from the mouth of her longtime lover. It had been a good many years since he and Muldoon had last talked about her, his own memories of the woman they'd unknowingly shared having faded into nebulous gray clouds as surely as Muldoon's had disappeared completely.
She was beautiful, Lewis,
Muldoon sighed.
The most beautiful gal in the West.
Again he smiled. Yes, she was, Muldoon. Lewis choked back the tears that ran thick and salty along the back of his dry throat.
Too much love for just one man.
Muldoon repeated the mantra they'd so often shared over the years following Beth's burial. That's precisely why there were two of us, my old friend. Lewis finished his friend's words and forced a wry smile.
She had the most perfect skin, and it smelled of honey,
Muldoon reminisced, his eyes brimming with fat, salty tears.
And that booty, oh lordy, I remember that behind of her so well, Lewis.
Lewis patted his friend's hand. Even after all these years and the trips down memory lane he and Muldoon had shared on those long beer-soaked nights, it still tugged at his heart some to hear Muldoon talking about Beth, his Beth. But yes, Lewis was the first to admit that his wife had been blessed with the most extraordinary rear end.
I remembered her hair, and the way it smelled of daisies, and how she would glow when she made love. It was like there was a small, delicate fire burning deep inside her.
Muldoon smiled and his eyes looked directly into Lewis's, but he was still not really seeing him. I'm happy for you, Lewis told his friend as he fought back the acid pang of jealousy that rose up inside him, not for his wife's infidelity with Muldoon, but for his friend's memories of the woman they had both loved so completely. It had been a long, long time since he had been able to recall just how sweet Beth's hair had smelled.
You should write all of this down in your notebook, Lewis, Muldoon told him, so you don't forget.
Lewis nodded and looked down at the moleskin in his hand, quite surprised to see it there. He flipped the thing open, dug the pencil from his pocket, and scribbled frantically at the thick, luxurious pages, all the while keeping half an eye on the strange man who had his most ordinary-looking hand rested upon Muldoon's head.
They're all with me now, Lewis, Muldoon murmured.
Who's with you?
Beth, my family, my old friends, the whole goddamn band.
That's just great. Lewis glanced up from his notebook just in time to see the whites of Muldoon's eyes as they rolled up into his head.
Yeah, and we're living our last days together, you and I,
Muldoon said with a contented sigh.
We're sitting on that porch, knocking back the cold uns, and putting this whole messed up world to rights.
That sounds just perfect to me, old friend, Lewis said.
And we're reminiscing, Lewis.
Muldoon's eyes once again burned deep into Lewis's.
We can reminisce. We remember everything. It all came back.
He reached out with a trembling, fevered hand and grasped Lewis's, and in that instant, Lewis remembered too. He recalled with startling clarity that he had seen the strangely ordinary man before, and that the man did indeed have a purpose. He remembered being there for Chuck, Janie, and Smiler as they similarly played out the remainder of their days in minds unfettered by dementia and surrounded by the resurrected memories of the ones they loved. All thanks to the hands of the average-looking guy in the hat. A swift, unexpected movement, the stranger's free hand, nothing more than a blur as the man slit Muldoon's throat, and a thick spray of blood shot out. "What the?" Lewis cried out. His shocked scream strangled into silence in his own throat. He tried to move from the bed, away from the thick wash of blood that poured from his friend's lacerated throat and soaked into the pristine white bedsheets. But Lewis found that he simply couldn't. By a cruel combination of his locked hip and terrified shock, he was rooted to the spot. The stranger shushed Lewis once more, the finger to those terribly nondescript lips now sporting what appeared to Lewis to be a long, curved claw of sorts. The man in the hat offered up a flicker of a smile and licked the thin line of blood from the claw with a thin, flat tongue. All the while he kept his other hand planted firmly on the old man's head. Muldoon's eyes rolled upwards once more, as if venturing away to marvel at the countless returning memories deep within his decaying brain, and this time they stayed there. Lewis scribbled frantically in the moleskin, and it was a moment or two before he realized that his friend had finally passed. Only when Muldoon's relaxing body let out a long, rattling sigh from one end and the pent-up gas from the other did Lewis look up from his notes to see his friend's peaceful, smiling face and half-closed and unmoving glassy eyes. "Oh no," Lewis groaned. "No, no, no!" The tears flowed thick and fast from his eyes, which served to make Muldoon's slack face appear blurry around its edges. "Don't cry for him, Lewis," the stranger said, his voice hushed. "Your friend died happy. He died remembering." There was no trace of emotion or any accent to the man's tone. It was most decidedly blank. You did that?" Lewis's voice shook with emotion. He sniffled up a thick gobbet of mucus and swallowed it down with an audible gulp. He looked at the stranger directly in the eye, but still his befogged brain refused to register any of the man's features other than those cold gray eyes. "It's why I came here," the strange man told him. "It's why you all invited me during one of your moments of forgotten lucidity. I have to have my presence requested, as you may, or may not, recall." Lewis stared at the man, and honestly he couldn't recall a damn thing. "Whilst it can't cure you of your most unfortunate affliction, I can give them back all of your memories for one final glorious time before—" "You kill us?" "Before I release you," the stranger said with that calm, level tone. "I give you the opportunity to live out your last moments with the comfort of the memories that you have so sadly lost through the ravages of this most unpleasant disease." "You killed him," Lewis mouthed as he looked down at Muldoon and the spreading scarlet mess that soaked into the bed. "All part of the bargain for my kindness," the stranger said, and still Lewis could not detect an accent. "And now it is time for me to take my payment." So saying, the strangely average-looking guy in the hat drew that grotesque elongated claw of his around Muldoon's face. Lewis winced as he watched the obscenely sharp fingernails sink deep into the edges of his friend's face, and as the wrinkled old skin peppered with white stubble parted, he could see that the claw had sunk deep into the shining bone of Muldoon's skull. "You really don't need to see this," the stranger told Lewis as he began to prise away Muldoon's face. "I don't see why not." Lewis was defiant. He wanted to stay with his friend no matter what. He simply couldn't bear to leave the man he'd shared so much of his life with. It's not as if I'll remember a goddamn thing tomorrow, is it? Lewis knew all too well that if he fell asleep, although after this sleep no longer seemed likely to Lewis ever again, he would forget absolutely everything he'd witnessed. "Although I do have my notes," he said absently. "Ah, yes, the book," the stranger said. "Thank you so much for reminding me." He gave Lewis a faint, wry smile as if they were sharing a secret and very personal reminiscence. He then reached across the bed over Muldoon's leaking body and plucked the notebook and pencil from Lewis's hands. Lewis looked on helplessly as the moleskin was taken from him and his hands simply refused to resist. The man tore out the couple of pages upon which Lewis had so meticulously made notes on the night's happenings. He screwed them up with one hand and secreted the crumpled paper in the outside pocket of his drab gray jacket. Then he flicked through the book with that long, terrible claw of his and came to rest upon a page close to the beginning. As Lewis watched, the stranger took the pencil to the names listed there in neat, girlish handwriting in the middle of that page and crossed out Whitey Muldoon with one firm, decisive stroke. Coldness spread through Lewis's body that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature in Muldoon's room, and everything to do with the realization that it was his own moniker that was next on that ominous list. And below that, Constance's name. Lewis hoped that when his time with the strange, ordinary-looking man in the hat came along, the old girl would be there for him and to hold his hand whilst his memories returned. The stranger placed the notebook carefully on the bed, away from the blood, and went back to working at Muldoon's face with his claw. Lewis fought the feel of his leaden eyelids as sleep began to creep up on him, determined to stay awake and remember everything that had happened, was happening to his old friend. Perhaps then he'd be able to reverse whatever process he and the others had set into motion to summon the stranger and save him and Constance from the same fate as Muldoon. But something resonated deep inside his psyche, something far beyond the reaches of the dementia that was slowly but surely destroying the person that was Lewis Jones. And he wasn't entirely certain that was really what he wanted, given Muldoon's revelation of returned memories right before death spirited him away. Eventually, inevitably, and despite his very best intentions, Lewis succumbed to the seductive siren call of a deep, untroubled sleep. He slumped down on the bed next to his old friend and drifted back to 1956, where the Presley Kid was storming the charts and his father was up in arms and banning Lewis from the music stores on account of the fact that it was nigger music. And whilst Lewis slept, the strange man in the hat tore away Whitey Muldoon's face with a wet, crackling slurp, and upon conjuring a small golden spoon from an inside pocket of his dull gray jacket, he began to feast upon the old man's diseased brain. And since there was no one to see, he allowed his facade to slip, revealing to the cool night his true appearance, and in that repulsive inhuman form, even his empty eye sockets, set in raw, bloodied, shifting flesh, had small, sharp teeth. It was just the two of them at breakfast this morning, Lewis and Constance, and they sat in silent contemplation of their untouched breakfasts of sausage and eggs that congealed in fat before them. "Ain't no wildcat did that to Muldoon," Lewis broke the quiet between them, his voice pulling Constance from her foggy wool-gathering with a start. "I saw the poor bastard's face, and I'm telling you, whatever did that wasn't a freaking wildcat." Already the mental images of what he'd seen on his way past Muldoon's room not 5 minutes before were fading fast. He'd seen a couple of cops in there, along with Carl and someone else in the center's uniform that he couldn't quite place. And he knew that sometime before lunch the nice men from the funeral service would be along to bag up the sorry-looking remains of Muldoon and cart him off to wherever they took the deceased inmates of Silverado Springs to. And for the life of him, Lewis couldn't remember anything about the poor old bastard. Perhaps he'd been one of the new ones.
"You have a visitor, Mr. Jones,"
Stacy blustered as she ushered a man in a gray suit into the dining area. The facility chihuahua that had been hiding under the monarch table, rich pickings to be had beneath the old folks, them being such messy eaters, scooted away with a loud yelp as if someone had kicked it. Lewis watched the dog scamper away with its tail tucked right between its scrawny little legs, and thought it strange that it seemed to be terrified of the stranger. Any other day, and Chico would be over and humping a visitor's leg before Stacy had time to shoo him away. "Thank you, Stacy," the man said to the fat care assistant with the slightest of smiles dancing about the corner of his mouth. "Mr. Jones, Miss Constance." He greeted the two seniors at the table and sat down next to them. "Do we know you?" Lewis grumbled. He hated having his meals interrupted, and he meant to ask Stacy something about something he'd seen upstairs earlier when she happened by, but now he'd forgotten what. He watched with a growing frustration at his failing mind as Stacy waddled away. She turned around every few steps or so to glare at the new arrival, each time shaking her head as if there was something about him that troubled her.
Louis,
Constance admonished.
I'm so sorry for my friend's brusqueness, Mr.
Ah, please forgive my lack of manners, the man said. With a broad, toothy grin, he fished out a crisp white business card from his pocket. He placed it on the table by Constance's teacup.
So, Mr. Ordinary Man?
Constance read from the card with its sharp, precise corners.
To what do we owe this pleasure?
Nothing too exciting, I'm afraid. I just wanted to return this. I do believe it's yours. The man addressed both Constance and Louis. He produced a gray moleskin notebook from his inside jacket pocket and laid it gently on the table between the two old friends.
Thank you,
Constance said. She peered down at the notebook as if it were something altogether alien to her, although she was too polite to say so.
My pleasure, Constance, the man smiled. I'll bid you both a good morning now and leave you to your breakfast.
He stood up from the table and made to leave.
I'll see you both later.
Louis glowered at the man. Something lurked at the distant and murky reaches of his deteriorating mind. It chattered quietly to Louis, and he couldn't help but think he'd seen this dull-looking man somewhere before, and just how rude it was that he hadn't taken off his hat at the breakfast table. The end.